Oh, one of the first things you have to know as a researcher, graduate student, or if you're an undergrad too, trying to share results of your studies, or if you're working with your professor, or if you're a professor or a graduate student from a master's or a PhD, you have to also acknowledge that probably you have more knowledge in a specific field than the regular normal lay people out there in society, and that doesn't make you any better or worse person, but it's very important to acknowledge that positionality. There's a process named self-reflexivity. What self-reflexivity means is taking time aside to acknowledge and understand who you are and what's your positionality in the world, right? So how to be mindful, how to understand yourself in the world. It can sound like a very philosophical question, right? It can be a little bit conflicting and say like, oh my God, what is she talking about, right? But before you enter looking for people to talk about your research, you have to acknowledge also how to engage them in a way that's actually useful for them. What I'm gonna say is something that's gonna empower them or left them more worried than before, is actually that's gonna be useful or not, is something actually that's worth listening to. So all those questions need to be understood. People actually wanna listen something that's gonna help them do better or solve their daily dramas. So when we do self-reflexivity, I highly recommend you to take some time. So I don't know, make your favorite coffee or tea and sit down with a notebook and check our self-checklist that we're gonna do. So this is my notebook, and how you're gonna do that is just checking the self-checklist that we're gonna revise and write down your feelings. And let's do two clear differences after you check it, and keep this in mind from the beginning. What's the goal of your research? Aiming to think about an audience that's, I don't know, mothers and mental health, or youth and mental health. Anything specific that you're trying to communicate through your specific study. And what's your purpose besides being a professor? Take a couple days to do it. These are not easy questions. And make sure probably to have somebody you trust in order to dialogue with this. It's very important, like, you get self-awareness about this. If you have trust in your research group with your professor, or somebody you appreciate, you live with, and you can reflect about this. First section of positionality and identity. The first section thinks about how do my background, experiences, and identity, such as gender, race, education, and discipline, shape the way I communicate with science. Think that way in a way that's also inclusive. Don't use your identity in a way that's repelling people, but also how you can use either way that identity as a way of inviting people to join. If you're a funny person, how you can maybe make a funny joke, or your quirkiness a trait that people is gonna make more engaging. The question is, how aware are you of your positionality as a researcher or communication professional that's gonna influence the trust that you have in your audience? So this is a very important question. Usually, researchers don't know that people, by the title or merely by showing a research paper or a credential or the saying of like, according to a study or scientists affirm, people already will be biased to say like, oh, this is actually something I might be listening to. However, the way we approach people is highly important. So how we frame ourselves is very important. So self-reflexivity is gonna give you ideas. What's the best way I can approach and use my identity, but also my real personality? So this is not an exercise for you to create like a fake personality or become like a fake persona that you are not in order to communicate your message. The third point is about how you have considered your perspective might influence or scientific findings the way you choose to communicate. So your perspective are also your personal biases. It's important to acknowledge that's very hard to be unbiased, right? So you have to think about how your personal beliefs, your religion, your political orientations, and everything like that can be influential in the way you communicate, right? So for example, in my personal biases, I believe that every single person should have a saying in every decision that is taken. However, we already know that it is impossible to make every single person happy, and there's always people falling behind, sadly, right? But how we can negotiate those points, that's my personal outtake, right? But how I find a way to communicate that in my own personal research, maybe the strategy, right? Make more dialogical strategies, make colloquiums. Don't choose communication that's only one way, right? Like me just talking to a screen, and don't listen to the comments that I get. So all these ideas that I get, what I write or read these questions are my self-reflexivity that I should keep for my own. So the purpose of this exercise, as you have seen, is reflecting who you are, but also getting these prompt ideas of how you're going to communicate in the future about your research. How your audience is like. Are there children? Are there elders? Are there Latinos? Are there mothers? Are there Asian Americans? Are there people from a specific nation? What are their cultural norms? What are the issues that mostly affect them? Economic, political, educational, maybe climate change that affects all of us, right? Like think about all the levels of information that you can get them mostly from prior studies, doing a little bit of formative research, but also trying to approach all this information and background knowledge before you enter a conversation face-to-face with an NGO or a community organization. So you can have this background information and sensitive information that gives you some background in order to not be culturally insensitive when you arrive. Why? Because these cultural norms can deeply affect the way they see you when you are not aware of specific things. So for example, when you reach out to Latinos in Latin America, in any other culture, and you don't have an interpreter and you expect them to talk always in English, pretty much people is going to be disengaged. Of course, there's a high number of bilingualism, but it's your responsibility if you're doing the outreach either to find a translator, have a member of your research team that's bilingual, or also make things also easier because you're the interest party as well, right? So in other things, you have to think about also the access the audience has. In these days of technology, we might think that every single solution happens through the internet and social media. We're wrong. Specific social groups, for example, might prefer not to have social media at all, might prefer to meet face-to-face. In life, my dear researchers, don't happen on campuses, happen in coffee shops, happen in train stations. It happens on markets, in different places, right? Sometimes when you do events on campuses, right? How accessible is actually your campus? How easy is to go or not, right? So probably you might be thinking that if you're doing an outreach activity, it would be better to think on a space or on a location that's more accessible to your audience rather to drag people always to your comfort zone. Think about accessibility, literacy, digital access. Don't be biased thinking that everybody has a smartphone, everybody has internet, everybody has a car to move. Do the background research about them and think about those disparities and how to be inclusive enough that those disparities are not something that repels people or says like, oh, that's cool, but that's not for me. So how those disparities could be a block or a barrier for you to get to them. And actually, sometimes the people that's the hardest to reach are the ones that need you the most. When you're gonna explain something, make sure you mention what that means. And other things is specifically make sure your communication avoids reinforcing stereotypes or marginalizing specific groups. So if you're gonna make a case study or portray a person, don't use specific portrayals for movies or that always perpetuating these images of specific racial groups or specific people. And think about how you use the communication in a way that focuses on solutions and positive frames rather than negative frames that are already there spreading constantly negative information, right? I'm not saying that everything has to be bright and positive, but focus on solutions rather of damage-centered communication. And ensuring that you are not always talking down to people. How you can ensure that people want to come to see you, wants to enjoy the discussion. So always discussions are not happy and productive, and you're not gonna be the superstar always, right? But always think about how that's something meaningful as well. Those discussions are something that provides feedback, that leaves the question open. So sometimes the good research is the topic that always ends up in open questions as well. How we have to keep developing the field. Are you providing the opportunities for the audience to provide those questions, to give the feedback? So always think about also from your perspective, how you can provide that opportunity to feedback, to ask you questions, to make time to respond those questions, to interact according in a respectful way. So for example, I want to tell you some specific cases that I have faced. In many prior projects, researchers have wonderful ideas about the future and mobility or nutrition or mental health, right? And then we come with all of these corpuses of research and studies, and we want to ground that research in a specific context, right? And we know it's an issue. Climate change is an issue. Mobility is an issue. Nutrition is an issue, right? However, we don't consider how complex is that for people to do that on a daily basis. If people still have to commute, there's not enough trains, there's not enough buses, they don't pass at the time you need to get to work. There's a high complexity, right? Like even if I want to be sustainable, I cannot afford a scooter or an electric bike, or the weather is excruciating, so I always end up arriving to job sweating or like late, so it's not sustainable for me. So which are my options as a researcher? Like if I tell them like, be sustainable, move sustainable, eat healthier, actually the tool they need is how to adapt that into their daily lives. It's not me telling them, stop buying cars that moving with gasoline. It's not me telling them, don't eat processed food. The question is what I should eat with the budget that I have, right? What I should be doing differently and how I do that. So possibly the answer on the tool is super simple or super complex, but how you will know that if you don't listen to people. So I hope you enjoyed this first tutorial. I would like to know what you did. You're invited here. I'm gonna put a link so you can download the self-checklist in the comments. And please share your questions. Please share your ideas with us. Thank you so much.